Yeah, I think this is a great place to begin because when I was doing some research on putting together this series, I came across, actually my partner came across this, but I stole it from them. My partner, the etymology of apocalypse goes back to the Greek for uncover or reveal. And there were so many points in your reading when I was thinking about that. You know, I've also experienced the loss of a parent, and that is definitely a kind of apocalypse. And, you know, Trump's presidency was, I think, an incredible moment of reveal and uncovering. And so I guess I wanted to ask about the act of writing or art making, and if you feel like it, how it might be connected to this act of unrevealing or uncovering. And so, is writing apocalyptic?
That's a great question. I mean, there are certainly days when writing feels apocalyptic, or art making, I think, feels apocalyptic to anyone who makes art. But I do think that art making is a response to apocalypse or to crisis for the reasons that you're talking about. I do think that, and sometimes the simple act of documenting what we see, what we register, can be the beginning steps towards naming, recognizing what is there that needs to change, and then potentially changing it. And I think I'm as someone who self-questions a lot, I mean, I think I'm suspicious of art making as the only response to crisis. Like, I think it's important that we think about sort of multiple responses, but there's something really fundamentally useful, both, I think, for an individual. Like, there's something that happens transformative that can happen to me when I'm engaged in art making, and that's important for me. And then there's something that can hopefully be transformative or viewpoint changing or educating, not in a revealing, I guess is to use a better word, about interacting with art, that I think, you know, is necessary whenever we're faced with crisis, or as we're faced with the continual state of crisis that we seem to be in the US, in late capitalism, late empire, etc.
Yeah, and also, like, that, I think that brings me to this point of, like, you know, there's a lot of other things I feel happening, especially in Defacing the Monument, but in a lot of work where it's not just writing, it's research, it's like remembering, it's witnessing, and it's all of these like physical forays into the world that are, you know, a part of, but also an extension of writing. And so, which brings me to the archive that I have so many questions about the archive for you, because I have like this mixed relationship with it, which is like, it does do this like apocalyptic job of like uncovering or revealing, but it's also, it maybe somehow it burdens us. And because, you know, you talk about this in your book, but documentary poetics is this kind of extension of an archive. But I think it's also an act of preservation of the archive, which is it's complicated, I think, for me, because it depends on the archive. Because a lot of our archives exclude voices and skew things towards white supremacy and other violence. And so I find some encounters with the archive very difficult, and some of them very beautiful and tender. So I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this complicated relationship with archive, and then, like, especially in this context of like revealing and possibly like starting over after something has ended.
I think, yeah, I think, in some ways, like your question is sort of pointing to its own answers, right? That there's archives are never neutral, right? Bodies of information. They're curated. And they're often curated by those in power. So they tend to represent particular kinds of interests to the exclusion of other kinds of voices and other kinds of information. And so I think while the archive can be useful in that for the first step of getting things down, they're always a start. I think there are so many amazing examples of, the natural one that comes to mind is Song by Norbese Philip, right? That the archival, it's a work that sort of grapples and pushes through and shows us that you have to go beyond the initial document, the archive, to actually tell the full story. And I think as important as that notion of sort of remembering the limits of the documents in the archive, I think there's also the need to sort of tune ourselves into alternative kinds of archives. So what because it's a way of contesting the things that are left out. So what do our dreams tell us? What does our imagination tell us? And maybe it's uncomfortable to think of those things as an archive, but I use that term because they are also sources of knowledges, kinds of knowledges that I think are important for us to be registering. I often point students to the Book of John by Eleni Siklianos as a book that it's a book about mourning. It's the book about losing someone and reimagining in some places a relationship, and that's a book that chronicles dreams, and that's a book that imagines things that don't exist. And I think I think as your series and your work sort of points us to, it is in some ways it's really easy to see the crisis. It's really easy to name the apocalypse, but we need to also think about what happens next. And in that, I think art also has its function in a deep way, but some of that is an imaginative function, and we can find that in relation to the archive, but we're not going to find imagination in the archive, if that makes sense.
Yes, I also thought of Sadia Hartman's Wayward Lives and Beautiful Experiments. And critical confabulation is such like a useful phrase for me to think about in this way. And also I also wanted to bring in the word witness, because so much of interacting with an archive that's also interacting with real life events, like indefacing the monument is an act of witness. And so I was thinking about that in reference to like the past year that we've all experienced. It's been this a pretty incredible shift of positionalities that's pretty constant. There have been points where the self is the victim of some violence, and then at the next moment you are witnessing violence that you might be in a privileged position on, and then it keeps switching back and forth. And so this blurred line of witness and like active participant or victim or perpetrator, these borders get blurred, or they have for me this past year. And so I guess I'm wondering what you think about like the relationship between witness and someone who's experiencing violence, and like what kind of ethics are contained in that relationship, and how do you navigate a careful relationship there?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, those are the questions that are really central to the book. So I'm glad you're bringing it up. I do think personally, witness is well, it's a complicated term, and in some ways, it's not as useful to me as the idea of thinking about the ways in which we are accomplices or connected to what we are seeing. So, like to take it back into sort of the stories or the issues I was dealing with in defacing the monument. I was witnessing, to use the word that I just refuted, but I was working on the U.S. Mexico border. I was working there with students. We were visiting migrant aid shelters. We were attending Operation Streamline hearings in which detained migrants are sentenced to serve jail time for the felony of entering the United States. And so there was the desire to say, I have seen this and I want to share this information with others, which sort of puts me in the position of witness. But I think what was important to me was to also realize that I was complicit. Like, I was a US citizen and there was a judge at the front of the courtroom under a giant like seal of the state of Arizona, US District Court, who was sending these migrants to jail in my name to a certain extent. So there's a kind of responsibility then to how I interact with the story. That it is both mine and not mine. I was careful in this book to talk a little bit about my own family's immigration history in a way to suggest how different it was from the immigration stories that and the conditions that migrants face today. And I think that it's like to say, well, these are immigrants, but my family was immigrants too, so this is my story, didn't feel productive. Like, their story was never my story. But as a US citizen involved in the story, allowing these events to sort of happen in my name, that was an important point of sort of contact and involvement. And so it's not just like, for me, it was not just a matter of realizing that, okay, so I'm involved in the story, but then what's the next step? So in a small way, like a small gesture, is that half of the royalties that I'll earn from this book will go to support the Kino Border Initiative, which was a community partner that I've worked with that provides aid to migrants who are in Nogales, usually either having been deported or who are in the process of migrating to the US. So it was like a small way to acknowledge and to think beyond just my ability to share this story that's not really mine to begin with, if that makes some sense.
It does. Yeah, so I have a particular curiosity in this particular situation. Because I'm attending law school next year, and I think about well, I think about this all the time, right? Because especially these kinds of trials in particular aren't really I mean, there's no justice and there's no sort of like any participation in any of that system is kind of suspect and compromised. And so I like, so the position that you want as maybe as like a activist or a advocate in, like, as a lawyer or as someone else, would be to want to somehow bring healing or justice. But to me, like, the only way I've been able to see it working that way is to be participating in it and also trying to dismantle it at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And I think I mean, I have a student right now who's participating in the field studies program, which is the program that we run here in the US. I mean, the US, we run here at UA, the University of Arizona, in which we bring students to the US-Mexico border for a couple of weeks over the summer to begin research projects. And these are graduate creative writing students, and we put them in contact and in collaboration in these reciprocal sort of research projects. And one of the things one of the students this year is interested in is what is the difference between sort of crisis response activism and activism that seeks to dismantle the system. And I think that's a really interesting I'm like, it's not like something that's resolved in my head, but, on one hand, we need people to be dropping water off in the desert to keep people alive. And we need people to be doing everything they can to dismantle the immigration policy that forces people to cross the desert in places where there's not water. Like, I think at this moment, both of those things are necessary. And yeah, so I mean, I feel like, yes, we need people to contest and dismantle and the legal system that functions in such a way. But we also need people to be defending these people against the legal system as it functions, right? It seems like, yes, all of those things are useful right now, as well as people whose only job is to think about what might come next. Or maybe it's not their only job, but like, I think all of us need to be involved in thinking about what might come next, right? And that's the kind of complicated proposition of this particular moment. But they feel like the kinds of responses that are necessary.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it's just a very complicated thing, because you have to be almost like super disciplined psychically to be able to switch between working within a system and then also trying to destroy it, and then also trying to imagine, a different non-system maybe that could like inhabit it. And I guess I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for anyone watching this or that will watch this about like, is there like a way to do that with your writing?
I mean, I think the other thing too is realizing that we are all, and then like especially those of us who are white, I mean, who are benefiting from white supremacy, whether we want to or not, and who haven't had to experience so much of what our BIPOC colleagues and comrades have had to experience, like have particular kinds of work to do. So I wanted to sort of qualify of saying that all, but there's also this thing of which, and I'm not a strategist, and like what I hope is that somewhere there's the strategist saying, no, actually we need to provide aid up until this point when we destroy the system or whatever, but not being that strategist. I think we can also realize that we as individuals can't do everything. So in our sphere, what can we do best becomes what is the most ethical way to move through the particular situations and opportunities we're presented with seems important to me. And that is keeping in mind that we live in a system that thwarts our attempt to live ethically at almost every turn. I wish I had the exact source for this quote. I saw it on Twitter, but someone had pulled out the fact that the idea of so maybe someone in the audience, or after I get off, I'll fact check it myself, but that the idea of a carbon footprint came from an oil company, because there was the idea of like shifting the burden onto individual consumers as a way to take the burden off of companies. And so, I think there's lots of work to be done, but I also think we can, there are forces that want us to feel this paralysis in front of the amount of work that has to be done, and that want us to feel like, you know, the activism isn't good enough unless it's burning it down, or like, you know, that everything's a half step, and that this is a moment of urgency and crisis, so we do what we can do. And sometimes that doing is writing or is art making, and sometimes it's not. And that, I think sometimes when I have the healthiest relationship to my own writing, it is also to remember, as much as I want to hold myself to the highest ethical standards as I can on the page, that whatever I write is like part of this larger piece of everything else that's being written at this moment, and that I need to be responsible and accountable, but I might not be able to say everything, and I maybe don't need to, if that makes
Yes.
sense.
Yes.
If that can land us on a place that that is satisfying.
No, it reminds me so much of this conversation I was actually having with a friend earlier today. I mean, we were both going back and forth, like talking about, like, you know, how I mean, well, I mean, some people know, but the, you know, the large work of figuring out how to dismantle white supremacy, especially within your own self, and like figuring out the ways to go about that, and what are the most productive and actual ways to go about that. And I don't know if we totally landed on like concrete answers. I think it's probably a personal thing depending on histories, but one thing that did come out of it was like, I don't know if it's a part of the work to concentrate so much on yourself and to like move the energy outwards. So yeah, and to just keep working, even if it's, you know, not burning the whole, you know, Chase Bank down, but
yeah, no, I mean, I think it is, it's a process. It's going to be for white folk, it's going to be a constant, continual process. So we live with it. And as we're living with the process, the interior process, that that's our responsibility. We work on the exterior in the ways that we can, as much as we can. And gosh, let's listen to our BIPOC friends, you know what I mean? And ask them what they see is needed at the moment too, and help when and where we can. I mean, I think that's also part of the, like, you know, I wonder sometimes if it's not whiteness or if it's not empire that suggests that we have to have mastery over all of these things. Like, and so maybe we can say, gosh, I'm not the person to think about that we can imagine what the next step is. So let me do some work and some reading and listen to the other folks that can do it, you know, which is different than not opening yourself to a possibility of a next step, which is, I think, is important for us as artists and thinkers and citizens, right? Like, we need to be able to open ourselves up to that possibility and begin to imagine it in our work, instead of just doing the work of recording the apocalypse. And yet we should also not berate ourselves because we don't necessarily know what the next thing should look like. If that, you know what I mean? Like, if we can hold those two possibilities, I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I really appreciated about your recent book is that it asks so many questions. And I think that's another way of doing that, is just asking questions. And especially like this great form of like these worksheets, these pedagogies you brought in. I really loved them. Like these questions of like, does your name become a seed in the mouth of the document, and what grows from it? Or instructing us to make a map with no lines. And so, yeah, I mean, it got me excited because I was thinking about this series and I was like, maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's how you figure out what happens after the end, is you just like fill out these worksheets. And then,
I hope that'd be wonderful. I mean, but I think, you know, I do think some of it is like, what are we tuning ourselves to? And I think part of my documentary obsessions, or my desire to document, comes from a desire to understand and be accountable to this precise moment. And but I also realize the limit of that thinking, right? So this is again where, like, individually and imaginatively, what can we get ourselves to think beyond just that recording? I feel like there's possibility has to be part of it, right? If we're going to think about what comes next.
and like play and joy and
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We had the poet Khaled Matawa came to UA a few years ago and talked about some of the nation building work he had done in Lebanon. And, you know, he said something very simple. It was like a cast off, and I'm like paraphrasing, but I believe what he said was like, well, you know, if there's not love or joy or art, then why even have a revolution? And you're like, of course, right? Like, yes. I mean, I think again, like we're fortunate that there are many contemporary writers, many writers in the past who remind us of that work. I mean, Diana de Prima is someone whose work has been close at hand recently. And he's just amazing. Tango Eisen Martin, another poet whose work I greatly admire. And, you know, I think we are both, it is a burden to have access to so much information, but it is also you know, it is an amazing gift to have access to so much work and history to draw upon as we try to sketch out our own survival skills for this particular moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. Tango's a reader on my thesis committee. And so, you know, like something he said to me a couple times, he's like, you know, you can push as far as you want and you can like go as hard as you, he's like, but it has to be really good. It's like, he's like, if you're going to say it, it has to be really good. Like,
yeah.
Okay, like, so the standards of excellence like persist in the revolution, and that like somehow got me very excited. There's a last question that I ask for each of these, which was, if, you know, whatever this means to you, if it all ended tomorrow and something different happened, came next, what would you take with you? What would you preserve?
I mean, my daughter, I think that's, I think there's like I think that's a genetic imperative, but it's like the first thing that popped into my mind, and is the reason for my daughter and for everybody's daughters and sons and children everywhere, that the better next feels like an urgency, and why an end feels like an urgency too. It is interesting that I'm on a panel tomorrow night called "The Next American Poetry," and I thought, like, there shouldn't be a next American poetry, you know, like there's something about an end right now that feels much more useful than a next. And maybe that's a fantasy, but I think I want to see many more things end than I want to see them continue in some ways. And we'll just have to keep thinking about what's next in relation to what should be.
Yeah. The better next and an urgent end. I think that's a great place to end that. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you so much, Erika. This has been a great pleasure.
Yeah, this has been really wonderful. Thank you, everyone here that's watching and on YouTube and elsewhere and in, posterity in the archive that will come across this. I did want, our next event is May 10th with the interdisciplinary performer Suzanne Kite, which is really exciting. Xavier, I don't know if you have anything you want to say to wrap this up, but.
Yes. Thank you both for being here and for being a part of Wendy Subway. Events like this really make us a more informed institution and a better place to learn. And I'm so happy that our archive is public. And I hope to see you both soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful night.
You too. Bye.